just takes forever. It goes to Zoom, and then it eventually gets removed from Zoom when it gets uploaded to Google Drive. But it does work. It takes forever.
Okay, I started recording to the cloud. Let's cross our fingers that we'll be able to find recording later. Thank you everybody for attending. I realized this is really difficult for some people because it's really early in the morning. Hello, Brendan. So right off the bat, I want to talk about what is this meeting and what we need to do in this meeting. So we're here to discuss the minimum viable change for the cross-project triggered by implementation. The end goal of this meeting is having an approach defined for implementing this. And that approach does not have to be a finalized proposal, but we need to know which approach are we going to take at implementing this, because it's really late in the cycle and we still don't have a general overview of where we want to go with this feature. And if we don't have the approach figured out by the end of this meeting, then that puts this cross-project this deliverable for 11.9 at risk. And it's basically a direction deliverable, so we probably should focus on not missing it. And I took a look at other deliverables, and I think it's medium profile, so there's some community attention, but not a lot. And I have a link in the issue. And basically, there's two approaches that we talked about so far. One of them is adding, so just so we're on the same page, this is basically for adding implementation, for adding a section in the downstream pipeline YAML that defines that pipeline is triggered by an upstream pipeline in a different project. So there's two ways we discussed about going. So we discussed two approaches for this. One of them is adding a special stage at the end of the upstream pipeline with all of the downstream triggers. So it's one stage at the end of the pipeline that triggers all of the downstream pipelines. And the other approach is just adding a trigger job at an arbitrary location anywhere in the pipeline. So
can I think I can shine some light on this, because I feel, and as well as looking at your latest comment, I feel that there is some miscommunication, or at least we're not aligned on thinking patterns here. So let's first off define what is already inside the application right now, right? We got triggered, so not the functionality that this issue will implement, but we got the cross-pipeline project, cross-project pipeline functionality already in there. It currently uses the triggered keyword, and it has a front-end implementation already that displays both upstreams as well as downstreams, right? And how I thought of this, and regardless of how many problems it might introduce potentially, my thinking was here that we could reuse that existing functionality in there, though the direction that the triggered by keyword functions as is the other way, right? You define this in the downstream instead of in the upstream, and it will trigger the downstream pipeline.
That's true. However, I think that we are missing one important piece of a puzzle, and that all existing code we have and these two approaches we currently support using triggers keyword in GitLab CI YAML and triggering pipeline using CI job token through the API. Both solutions, both approaches result in having a multi-project pipeline. Are a little different than triggered by, because in the former case, this is always one-to-one relationship, and what we are trying to solve here is one-to-many, and that's a little bit different.
Yeah, especially because depending on where we put this. So if we know that we're going to define the triggered by section in the CI YAML of the downstream project, But in the upstream project, we're not really sure where we want to put this job. Depending on where we want to put this job, we might not rely on the bridge implementation that we have for triggered at all. We might have to do something different for that, which is why the approach actually defines the implementation, and the implementation defines the approach, which is why we have to discuss this beforehand. So if we go with relying on what we already have, we are kind of forced to put all of the trigger jobs at the end of the upstream pipeline, period. Like if we rely on what we already have, I don't think we can put them anywhere in the pipeline.
I don't think that using bridge jobs or trigger jobs, however we call it makes sense, because it means that a downstream pipeline is going to modify the upstream pipeline and put some arbitrary job somewhere in the pipeline. And while it perhaps makes some sense, because then we have a connection between a job in the upstream pipeline and a job in the downstream pipeline, putting some job into the upstream pipeline means that we need to calculate the status of this job into the status of the pipeline itself. So, I mean, it's a little tricky, because we are putting some arbitrary job into someone else's pipeline, and we having a status there, because a job is a status. In the backend code, it's even called the commit status, right? So it means that we are putting some status into someone else's pipeline. And how do we treat that? Do we change the pipeline status when our downstream pipeline fails?
So perhaps an idea, right? What if we skip the trigger job entirely, but still display the upstream pipeline that triggers that downstream in which the triggered by job has been defined? So it won't be visible from a UI perspective, but it will be active from a functionality perspective.
I'm not convinced it makes sense as well, because I envision this feature to be extremely useful in case of, for example, a popular Docker image that someone might want to rebuild, and all the downstream observers might want to rebuild their images as well when the upstream gets updated. Or perhaps there is some very popular library that gets included into your software, and you want to always keep your software up to date and, for example, update your software automatically when the new version gets released using a pipeline, for example, which means that we might end with hundreds of downstream pipelines watching the one very popular upstream project. And does it mean that we want to completely clutter the pipeline view for some pipeline, for someone who is an author of a very popular library, for example?
So I have one thought towards that, and that is the fact that I feel that we're mixing and matching release management with continuous integration. And the use case that you have, right, that you want to automatically, generate
GitLab CI is not only CI. GitLab CI is also CD. So CD means continuous deployment. So it is, related to release.
Yeah.
I understand. Though I want to make clear that the anchor point of triggering a downstream pipeline from I'm thinking here from an ideal situation, right? Not something intermediary, but so when do you want to trigger your downstreams, or at least other projects that depend on your, for example, your package, right, or your Docker image, etc. That is when you release that image. You send out a release. There's a new release that triggers all the downstream projects that rely on.
Well, yes, but it's the inverse case of this is, I want to trigger my pipeline. You might not even know about it, right? When you release. And so that's why we have this concept of on, right? So I might say not on every pipeline, I might say only on tags, right? Only when you tag your upstream thing, that's when I want to build mine, right?
The thing that I'm thinking here is there's a difference between internal use and external use. So internal use, it would make sense to trigger things based on the repository, right? But from an external use case, it makes more sense, in my opinion, to trigger things based on release management. Or am I completely wrong here?
Right.
The biggest problem here is that we're kind of changing someone else's pipeline from the downstream pipeline. Like, that doesn't really make sense. If I define something in my pipeline, I'm going to change someone else's pipeline. The upstream pipeline is going to be changed by my change, and that's problematic.
And that's very interesting because in software development, we do have this concept called inversion of control. And we usually introduce or invert the control when we want to decouple something. And in this particular case, it means that we not necessarily want to tell the upstream pipeline owner who is using the downstream pipeline, because this is the decoupling we can have in this particular example. This is actually quite similar with forks. So when someone forks your project, you might not be really, interested in that, especially when it's some popular open source library with hundreds or thousands of forks. But sometimes you might want to see who actually forked your project. And this feature is usually quite hidden in GitLab or GitHub. You need to click some button to see what the forks are. And I think that perhaps the most simple solution here is to just forget about showing that to the upstream pipeline maintainer or upstream project maintainer. And
I would be fine with that, to be honest. I'm more inclined like, hey, we need to show something on the downstream because that's where you configure it.
Yeah.
I want to know which pipeline. So for example, right, you can still configure multiple triggered bys in your CI, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And you want to know which one triggered it.
Exactly, and you need to know which pipeline triggered your pipeline and when and on what conditions. But it might be quite difficult to visualize that using features we already have, because this is one-to-many and not one-to-one relationship.
So another, thinking about this, where we have some dependents that rely upon others in shell scripting, you have a utility called watch. So that's how you depend on some change, and then once that change happens, you can do something else. The reason why that works is because it constantly monitors the thing that's supposed to change. And in our case, we can't really do that. So that's the problem here. It's really where the triggering the pipeline needs to originate. So how do we know that the upstream pipeline finishes is going to trigger the downstream pipeline? And we really can't without changing the upstream pipeline, the only way we can do that is by constantly monitoring if it happened, and that's not really something we can do. So
we are now talking about the more like the functionality aspect, right? Not the UI impact it has.
It's completely functionality and definition of the feature is kind of tied together. You can't really, how you think about the feature changes how you implement it. So it's kind of, we're talking about both of those things at the same time because they rely upon each other.
Yeah, I'm thinking here of like, what is the impact on front end and what is the impact on back end? And that change, right?
I have some ideas how to implement that on the back end, and some ideas about how to reuse existing front end solutions. So perhaps I can share that if you are interested. So
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that we currently do have pre-jobs implemented, right? And we currently have all the front-end implementation that we use to show the connection between a job and a pipeline trigger. So it might make sense to actually reuse pre-jobs indeed, but not in the form that it's quite intuitive for us, because it's quite intuitive for us to place a brief job in the upstream pipeline, because this is how triggers by works. It's going to this direction. So I mean, a brief job that triggers a downstream pipeline is inside your upstream pipeline, and it points from upstream to downstream, like it's natural direction, something that we understand. However, in this case, we are inverting the control, which means that perhaps the bridge job should appear in the downstream pipeline and point another direction. This way, we can also take a status of the upstream pipeline into account into our downstream pipeline, because we have the status attribution feature on our roadmap, and we want to make it possible to configure a bridge job in a way that the status attribution works, right? Do you guys know what the issue about the status attribution is? It's I think it's we do have that on the roadmap. It's about waiting for the upstream pipeline, downstream pipeline to finish. Anyway,
Yeah.
so we can use the bridge job to actually and create it in the downstream pipeline when the upstream pipeline gets triggered, gets created, and we also can configure in that bridge job the behavior, whether it's going to have status attribution or not, and we can reuse existing bridge job. It means that we would need to change the syntax of our feature proposal, because it's not going to trigger by, but it's going to be yet another job very similar to the job that has triggers keyword, but in this case the keyword would be different, and we can have multiple jobs like that. And that's probably the most simple way to reuse existing implementation on backend and frontend.
From my understanding, you intend, so first off, we're not going to show any downstreams in the upstream pipeline. We are going to show the upstream pipeline in the downstream pipeline and the job that triggered from that upstream, right? However, there can be multiple of those triggered jobs, you say, because it's the downstream, not the upstream, right? And what I get from you, I think, is that we'll only show the job that actually got triggered.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense to me as well.
I think that makes sense.
Like that.
Yeah, and let's leave status attribution out of this discussion for now, because it'll be easy to build upon once we build this, but we doesn't.
Actually, in this case, the status attribution code and implementation is going to be exactly the same. And this, we could reuse that instead of implementing another solution for status attribution in case of triggered by, because we would use the same bridge job mechanism.
Yeah, I mean,
I think it's fine as it is today. There's a lot of work we have to do with status attribution, as Fergus mentioned. Like, we've got an issue open about deterministic status and a couple other things too. So, but yeah, obviously fixing the world of that is out of scope for this.
So I think we kind of align on the idea of having jobs in the downstream pipeline pointing towards the upstream pipeline, kind of inverse of what we have in the proposal currently.
Yeah,
they'll always
just
be
kind of
first stage, right?
Sure.
Yeah, they'll have a stage, right? Like then you can have like a triggers stage, basically, is my thought. Like I'm going to change the proposal right now to, I think, reflect what we're talking about. So hold on just 1 second and we'll have that.
I mean, we could even so say the current situation is that from a upstream pipeline that triggers a downstream, so not the thing that we're now implementing, the job can be in any stage of the pipeline regardless. However, now we're looking at the downstream, right? It should be one of the first stage optimally, because it always gets triggered.
That's a great question. And I don't have immediate answer how this could look like.
Yeah, so both of those approaches have.
I perhaps even would say that we don't even have to show that job at all, because the upstream pipeline in the downstream pipeline detail view will be visible. So we can keep the jobs fully invisible, and it will just stream into the actual pipeline jobs that we already have defined, just as we do now.
don't we have the issue about making the visualization a little more obvious in the way that we link jobs to the?
Yeah, I know, and I want to keep that out of this discussion very much.
But this is quite important, because if we decide to actually use jobs as a real bridge between pipelines, then the way that we actually visualize that might matter.
I'd say in that case that not showing something at all is the safe choice and the minimal choice, and we can decide upon something like that later when we get to tackle that issue. I don't see it being a blocker or a problem for our implementation currently.
Yeah, so we were kind of running out of time, and we still have one burning question, which is are we going to have a stage at the beginning, or are we going to have like a free-flowing?
Perhaps the most simple solution is if you put the bridge job inside the pipeline instead of at the beginning, we skip jobs that are, that are on the left, right? How to say that in English? You know what I mean. We skip the jobs that should have been already processed.
Yeah.
If that's simple to do, I agree with it.
Does it make sense?
I think I agree with that if it's simple to do. I wouldn't want to, I guess the other thing I'm trying to protect is shipping, right? Like, and I think if we ship and we have a little thing outstanding, like, oh, we should skip jobs to the left. I would be okay with shipping and then saying, okay, but in 11.10 we're gonna, fix it. So I'm just trying to throw my hat in the ring that we should ship something better, and if we've got a couple of UX and or other things we want to do after, I would support putting that in the next release. To ship something, shipping something rather than
just going the path of least resistance, just so we should.
Exactly. Yeah, I think we've hit all the really critical things that would make make a major mistake. So I think we should be able to, assuming that all of the assumptions we're making now work out. And then I updated the description that has, if everybody could go look at that real quick. I put the link back in Zoom in case you missed it, but yeah, so sorry, that was two different things. One, we should take the path of least resistance on these smaller things so that we can ship. And then two, go look at the description. I think this is what Gregor's is proposing and everybody's kind of landing on.
There's also one additional concern. Perhaps it's just something that appeared in my mind, and perhaps this problem is not clearly visible for us, but we do have pipelines on many different branches, right? So we are able to define the upstream branch, but on which downstream branches do we want to trigger a pipeline? Is that something that we considered already?
So that's a good question. I would say if we considered it, again, maybe not in the first iteration, but if we considered it, we could use the only syntax, right? Like, now it's a job, right? So
yeah,
I know
exactly.
the bridge job.
If the only accept is going to evaluate in the way that the bridge job is not going to be created, we do not trigger a pipeline at all. So
yeah, I mean, that would be really cool.
with this bridge job, with putting this bridge job into downstream pipeline, we can use all the features we already have to control the behavior of when we trigger the pipeline downstream, or whether we are ready to see it at all.
So how would that function if the job is in the middle of the pipeline? So say the third stage, for example?
I would say that this bridge job would have only accept and all the features that we currently support with the bridge job. And if our pipeline evaluation mechanism tells us that this job should not be created in these conditions, we are not creating pipeline at all, right? If it gets created, then we skip all the jobs up to the bridge job in the pipeline stage and follow just normal pipeline processing.
I'm interested in what use cases that might prove valuable for?
Yeah, for example, if you don't want to duplicate jobs, for example, you would like to have your downstream pipeline independent, but when it gets triggered by the upstream pipeline, perhaps there is some overlap into what gets tested. Does it make sense?
Yeah, like if this thing is completely independent, this library is in some way completely independent from my build, right? So like say, I don't need to rebuild my application. I just need to make my Docker file again with it and my application. That would be a use case for it, right? Don't rebuild, just repackage, right? Basically, or don't rebuild, just release.
Yeah.
I don't know I don't know that that's the more common use case, but it is one that maybe.
Yeah, I mean, as long as we implement the MVC, we can build upon that and add different use cases. I don't think this is especially different for the first iteration, but we can, think about other use cases in the next iteration.
I'm on board with this. I think this is a solid thing to do.
The only last thing that I'm thinking about is renaming triggered by to perhaps subscribe or watch or triggers.
Observer, but yeah.
But
I was gonna bring that up. Mark actually pinged me, I think on this issue. Maybe can't remember who it was, but Mark Punzak actually came back to me and said, "Hey, is triggered by the right word?" And I was like, you know what? I don't know, because I didn't write this issue, and I've just been kind of going along with it because triggered and then triggered by. But
we already got problems with it because we already got triggered by API keyword, I feel, or I believe. So I'd say there's good cause to change it.
Yeah. Okay. So let's consider that, but hopefully we can get to an answer.
That async. Is there anything else we need to discuss while we're still on this meeting? Otherwise,
yeah, I'd like to quickly define as well for Scott and me if there's anything needed from you in order to have to move us to a solid implementation of this, because I feel we can reuse everything that is already existing in the UI, and this won't have a lot of impact on front end, right?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, it should be just reusing existing components. It's mostly just determining based on the backend response what to show when.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, that's another argument we keep coming up for. Maybe got a little confirmation bias, but we keep coming up with new arguments for why we should do it this way. But that's another argument to do it this way, is the UI will just work because it's a job, right? Like it'll work like the existing ones. Okay.
Sounds good.
Well, yeah. Thanks for putting this together, Mattia. This was really, really valuable use of time, showing how a little bit of sync can improve on a lot of bit of async. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody, for attending. I'm going to post a link to this meeting after I find it. So thank you and have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Yeah.